All right, so now we get to move on to doing some posing. So getting the living room visible again, first thing I'm going to do is figure out the scale for this guy. And so I'm able to just take my scale node and adjust it accordingly. I want this guy to be, uh, you know, basically as tall as a person, so around 6 to 7 feet tall. And so since I know that height there is about 7 feet, I've scaled him to about that size. So now what I'm doing, I open the script editor and I'm selecting all of the keyable controls for the character. And I can see in the script editor that it's just listing what I'm doing because I want to make a button on the shelf just to simplify setting these keyframes. And so then, so basically I have something that's going to select everything and then set a key. And just drag that onto the shelf. And that way it's going to be very easy for me to come up with some poses, set a key, change the frame number, and set another key for a new pose. So this isn't me animating. What I'm doing is I'm just setting keyframes for poses so that every frame represents a different pose. So it's easy for me to then just render out an animation where each frame is just a different pose for the character. So I'm not animating between those poses. We're literally just posing. So I'm just going to start messing with the rig. And so this is basically the first time that I've gone in and started sort of seeing what kind of positions he can get himself into. And so you can see my time slider down at the bottom is only 10 frames. So I'm going to do 10 different poses. And so I can basically go to a frame, pose the character, and then just hit this button up on the shelf, and then it just keyframes everything. And then I can go to the next frame, pose him, and set a key. And so at this point, as this is, really the first time I've posed the character, I'm just sort of messing around, setting some poses. And through this process, some of the poses I save, I might, overwrite with a new one if I find something that's more interesting. But from the perspective of creature development, this is definitely one of the most sort of fun, exciting parts of the process because finally you're sort of able to see what he can do. And granted, when we did our animation test right after the design iteration, where we just had the sort of really blocky version of the guy that we were posing, kind of the same thing then that we were able to do. It's just kind of, that wasn't on a final model. And so this is definitely a lot clearer to visualize. So on that last one, just able to see how long this guy's actually able to get. Because since the pose he was in the design, was relatively compressed, it was not necessarily evident how long he's able to extend himself as a result of the length of the rear leg and the length of his arms. So while he, can fit within a relatively human space, he also has the ability to, stretch himself out. And while he may be 6 feet tall right here, if he chooses to stretch himself out, he can really be like, 15 feet long. And so just messing around, since he's got the arms up, had to put the spikes down so he can support himself with those. And then just might go in and, adjust some of the poses. Maybe do some where he's further from the camera, some where he's closer to the camera. And I still have that, rough shader that we saw earlier, just a regular blend with the normal maps. So again, we haven't gotten to texturing or shaders yet. This is still just resolving form and posing and, resolving the character from a, more pure definition of the word character. What is his character? What, the poses say a lot about his potential behavior, much more so than textures or shaders do. Textures and shaders are much more of a finishing thing once you've already, established that you're happy with the general overall form. So now I'm just setting up my render settings so I can render these out. I'm setting the right camera. And then just gonna just do some test renders just to see what he looks like. So that's our neutral pose. There's him behind the curtain. And with these renders behind the curtain, I noticed that he was looking a little dark. So I'm making a spotlight, turning on decay, making it a warm sort of orangey color, turning on shadows, and then sticking it in the environment, inside there, because now we're kind of in the dining room and there are ceiling lights in there. Just scooting things to make room for 2 lights. I'm going to then do another render test. And so that one's kind of hard to notice if it made a difference, so just going to need to make it a little bit brighter. And also while I'm here, just filling up a couple holes. And then I just doubled the intensity of that light in the channel box, making it even warmer. And then I'm reducing the drop off. It was sort of had a little too much fall off. And now we can definitely see the light hitting him. So again, we can see a couple ceiling lights back there. So that's what I'm adding in. So comparing. Now I'm going to render him for that frame just to see if that's noticeable. So we can see that now, instead of being dark, there's a little bit of light coming from the spotlight that's up there. And then now just trying some of the other keyframes that I set. Oh, here I noticed that in the previous render, the fish tank was getting the shadow from the character, but since the fish tank is kind of self-illuminating, I didn't want the shadow from him to be so dark, so I'm sticking a little cube there. And then this, right now I'm noticing that I didn't align my camera properly or perfectly. I mentioned earlier when I aligned the camera and did this that I was kind of eyeballing it, not trying to be perfect. And here's an example where I can see that cube is against the wall of my scene, but we can see the perspective doesn't quite line up with the fish tank. But that's actually not a big deal because I'm just going to cheat. Turn off receive shadows. And so now you can see when I do a new render, the shadow from this guy that's falling on the aquarium is not hitting that part. So just a simple little thing just to have things make a little more sense. So now trying some of the other keys. And so here, just being able to see him overlapping. Here's one where he was very close. So obviously inside here, the shader is, not perfect. It's not tuned or whatever, but it's definitely good enough. So now I'm just editing some of the keys I said, just trying to make the pose a little more dynamic. And also just checking some of the contact points there. Just so that the poses get across also some of the functionality, for example, of those spikes. And then always going back to the shot cam, even though I might pose them from another camera that's a little more free to navigate or tumble around, I always have to check it to the shot camera, since that's the one where I got to make sure that the silhouette is reading. from that point of view. So obviously, since we have the environment in here, it's not purely posing, it's also posing to the environment. So it's also trying to sort of integrate him and make it a little bit more interesting. And so if I try, I don't know if I'm going to be able to scrub through. Now, there we go. So at least now, in this one, for example, we can see him, using his spike so that he's able to get his arms off the ground. We can see, that spotlight I added in there, just giving a little more illumination inside. It's kind of cool. I'm just scrubbing between all those different renders. So now that my test renders seem okay, I'm just going to go and render this out. And once it's rendered, I can just load them into FCheck as an animation. So since, they're all rendered as an animation, frames 1 through 10, I can just load them very quickly as an animated sequence in FCheck to quickly scrub between all the different renders. So each one, is giving me a different sort of impression of the character. And there you go. So with that said, now that we've done those, let me just pause for a sec, just so I can find those images so we don't have to look at them time-lapse. We can take our time with it. Okay, so here's those rendered frames. So now we're in real time, just so we don't have to keep up with the time-lapse recording. So I'll open one, and then I can go and open that animation. And so it's loading them in. So obviously, if I let it play, we're going to get this, which just makes it look like time-lapse of somebody cleaning the living room, which is kind of funny. But anyway, so if I just go through here, obviously we're starting just with his neutral pose based on the design. And then just showing him in the environment. And so again, you can see how the fact that we haven't done or hopefully you can see textures and shaders yet is kind of irrelevant for something like this frame. Because, even if he did have a final shader or a final texture, would he really look that different? It's like, sure, there'd be some variation in, color and pattern inside this area, but as the overall silhouette and form and vibe and stuff, it's less important than what we're doing right now. And so now getting him into the light, into the living room. So, clearly this shader, I'm just using the subsurface scattering on a blend, so it's, not great and completely, not tuned. So, it's just looking a little like glowy, but whatever. So here, a nice example of him extending himself out. Starting to go down those stairs. So clearly, really blown out inside here. I realized later that the area light that I had in the scene was angled not enough towards this. It's facing too much into the living room. So that's why he just seemed like the light's hitting him too hard. And there you go. So that's, our 10 renders. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So enough that definitely with these 10 renders, an extremely useful sort of addition to, our little, presentation package that we can show. And then also for something like this, being able to show this to somebody just to say, well, here's scale, so as far as the size of him, is this working correctly? And then also just trying to come up with interesting poses. But for posing the guy in this sort of background, we're going to feel kind of limited in what he can do. And so the next thing then is to also pose him just in an empty scene, because then you're going to feel a little bit freer to just try maybe more unusual poses. So we've posed him inside here. Now let's move on and continue with our video. So now I've got the guy in this scene. First thing I decided is that I wanted to, the shader that I was using in the living room scene has all of the normal maps connected to a single blend. And so with that, I can't show the normal maps in hardware. So Maya's hardware display of normal maps doesn't like it if normal maps are stacked. It likes to have each normal map be assigned to a different shader. So just for the sake of the pose tests that I want to do now, where I would like to see the normal map in Maya, it just the more accurately he looks like the character in Maya while I'm posing, the more sort of fun it is, the more interactive it is, the more you're kind of feeling the character in a way. So I'm just going and making sure there's a separate shader, assigned to each piece so that I can see the normal map. So I'm just reassigning the shaders I made before, when right after we exported them from ZBrush. And then now, since I do have multiple shaders, I still want to connect them to each other, just so that if I change the color or the specularity on one, it changes on the others. So that's what I'm doing now. I'm just having the torso shader drive the other shaders. So this isn't the way I would usually set up the final shader for stuff. This is just a preview shader I'm making so it looks good in hardware. For final shaders, I always try and have, for the entire character, or at least all the parts that are skin, have a single shader. Just makes it easier to edit one thing, and it's more efficient to have one shader in a scene than a bunch. But either way, so now I've got my normal map visible in hardware. I'm going to make a little ground plane. Just turning on my resolution gate, just so I kind of... one thing that's important to point out is that as I pose the character, I also am going to be choosing a camera angle that works well for that pose. So I'm going to be keyframing not just the character, but also the camera. So that's why I need my resolution gate for my camera to be on, that I'm doing the poses through. Here I'm messing around with shaders just to decide what shader I want to use for my pose tests. So there's just the blend. And then decided that it would probably be better to use ambient occlusion render. So I'm just created a mental ray ambient occlusion texture that I'm pumping into my shader. And so I'm making the color black and then putting the ambient occlusion texture on the incandescence. And so basically there's no shading calculated in the scene. So in my scene, if we pause for a second and look in the outliner, there's no lights in the scene. My directional light is off, the one I had for this render with the shadow on the ground. So it turned off my light, turned off my HDR that I have from the living room. So there's no lights in the scene right now. And so the only thing that's illuminating our render is the ambient occlusion texture on the incandescence of my blend. I'm also going to assign one to the ground. And then make the background color on my camera white. And then now just going through my different shaders and connecting, as we can see, making the color black and then connecting my ambient occlusion texture to incandescence. So I have two ambient occlusion textures, one for the character shaders and one for the floor. So now I'm just dragging in the shaders for the character and dragging in the ambient occlusion to the incandescence on all of them. So now if I render, now I'm checking, the camera background. Need that to be white. And so right now it's rendering as black. And now I got it to be white. So it was because my mental ray IBL node was in there. Even though I hid it, it was still affecting the rendering. And so since I don't need it for the rendering I'm doing, I just deleted it. And then I'll save the scene with a different name. So if I ever need that ambient or that IBL node back, I can always import it from another scene or just remap the HDR. So my camera background color is set to white. And here, let me just go back for a second so we can see that. All right. So I have my blend attached to the character and to the floor. My background color on my camera is white. And on the ambient occlusion texture, you can see that the bright spots are white. And so I'm losing the silhouette of the character here, right? Because we have a white background and the top of his head is white. So what I'm going to do is make my background color a little darker than white. And then the ambient occlusion texture on the floor, I'll match the gray point on the two of them. So we can see the ambient occlusion texture. We can adjust how bright the brightness of it is. And assigning that same gray to both the camera background and the ambient occlusion texture. Just checking. And then making it a little darker, the background. Saving. And so now we can see what I did. So now the background's a little darker so that we can still see the silhouette of the character. Easier to read. I'm just making him a little brighter so he's easier to see in hardware, because that doesn't affect the render. So now, once I have the ambient occlusion texture, I have everything set up, everything was working, he was rendering the way I wanted him to render. The problem is that with that ambient occlusion texture mapped to incandescence, it was making my character render as white in hardware, which would make it difficult to pose him. So now I'm just temporarily breaking the ambient occlusion texture from the shaders so that he looks like this again in hardware, just so I can pose him easily. Because it only takes literally 5 seconds to reconnect that ambient occlusion texture. Maybe 15 seconds. Not that long. Hiding the floor. Don't need it. Setting my time slider to 10 frames. And now time to pose again. So the subdivision level on the character, I set it to 1 just so the performance is a little faster when he's smoothed. It's not fully real time. And for posing, it's nice for him to be totally real time. Turning on my resolution gate. Keyframing the character. And then now I'm making another button to select my camera and set a keyframe and dragging that to the shelf. So again, I'm going to key the character and key the camera position. I have 2 buttons I need to hit for every single one of my keys. And so at this point, just messing around, trying to come up with some interesting poses for him. Trying to break things up so he's a little asymmetrical. Grabbing some of the finger joints and rotating those. And so it's easy with joints, just use the up and down arrow to change which joint on the finger I'm keyframing or rotating. So now trying something pretty different, you know, because in the end, theoretically, there's no reason based on his function and the joint rotation limits of, you know, what we've established he should be able to do with his joints. There's no reason why he wouldn't be able to do this. As long as his leg muscles are strong enough to support the weight of his upper body, he theoretically would be able to do this, which is kind of cool. Because basically he could go from being, you know, 6 feet tall to being like 15 feet tall if he wanted to. And then also in my button to keyframe the character, I hadn't added the fingers. So I'm just quickly adding that to my button. Or just making a third button. So I have one button to keyframe the character, one for the camera, and one for the fingers, just to make it simple. So just checking the keys that I've already made. So now I've got 6 different poses. Now maybe showing that he can support himself on those spikes even if they're not fully extended. I'm just going around trying to, again, be asymmetrical. Just make it a little bit more dynamic and a little more organic. So now we have 7. Now working on one where we can really see him sort of crouching. And then now I've got one where his spike is, instead of being used as a support, is being used as a weapon. Does look kind of funny. I won't say why, but it's pretty obvious. But either way, definitely showing range of movement. And also just showing that he's rather unique. So here I'm trying to show like, yeah, this guy can go from, 7 feet tall to 15 feet tall, just like that. So now maybe he's looking down on something. So granted, it looks a little goofy, and balancing seems like it would be, pretty difficult. But still definitely interesting and good to show, just to show range, especially if you're working on a project where, you're going to have a client that you're still engaged in trying to resolve options, that once you're showing things like this, it's a whole new direction for the character of what he can do, which can inform obviously animation later on. Having these key poses is pretty important, because with these key poses, this can, when the package gets delivered to the final effects vendor, showing these as like, here's the poses for this character that are approved. This is what a attack pose is. This is a crouching pose. This is a relaxed pose, and so forth. So now I'm checking the poses with him smoothed. But anyway, so yeah, showing approved poses is also an important part of the process. If you have a client or art director or director who wants to get involved to the level of sitting per character and creature and figuring out, what does he look like when he does this, then you can resolve that. Because clearly, with a character with the flexibility that this guy has, there's so much range of what he could do that if you don't define that to the final effects vendor, they could go all over the place with it, which, maybe they'll go in directions that, you hadn't thought of. So you want to kind of just be as prepared and well thought out as you can be. And so that's why we're doing all this. So now just testing my renders of these poses I made. So again, I made 10 poses. So we have 10 in the living room and 10 just in a neutral environment. And then there you go. So I batch rendered them. That's what I'm loading in right now. So my 10 frames. And that's the end of that clip. So let me just open those up. Let me just go and find those real quick. Okay, so here they are. Open that in FCheck. And let's open animation. So we rendered our 10 frames. Okay, stop. Alrighty. So here we go. So we've now gone through our posing phase. So we, rigged the character and then had to do a bunch of pose tests. And through the process of doing all these poses, you get to know the character and immediately start to get a bunch of ideas for what to do with animation. And so if I go through these, we can see, there's him standing up. Definitely weird. Crouched and extended. This looks kind of playful here, although that's menacing. Looks kind of curious there. Just looks like he's examining something, getting ready to use his hand. Here's our default pose just from our design, but at least we finally have the rear leg in the original position. Him just, almost the same, but crouching down, so we get a much sharper angle, just showing how much this thing can compress. Starting to show that he can use his fingers. So spikes down, propped up, fingers extended. So this is now showing us that, he has the tips of these sort of armor-plated forearms to walk on, but if he does need to use fingers, he does have them. So they're not necessarily, they don't, as a weapon, it seems like he would definitely just want to knock things around with this very hard-plated thing, or obviously kick things with the back of his leg. But having fingers is definitely going to show a sort of creepy sense of potential intelligence, because once you have fingers, you can use objects and use tools. So he easily, with 4 fingers, could be typing away at a keyboard if he wanted to. Operating some spaceship or something. So here's showing, as opposed to another render, that when he's up, that his rear leg, this, can potentially flatten out. So, and the funny thing is that, well, in our original design phase, this little kickback we put on the rear leg, I didn't do that thinking this would be the function of it. And so this is kind of like a happy accident that all of a sudden it's like, wow, that's kind of cool, because it actually kind of now feels like a proper balanced shape for him to be able to elevate himself and increase height, therefore seeming more, threatening or menacing to something. Plus, I mean, like a giraffe, with this incredible height, he'd be able to reach just about anything. And then here, once he gets on the tip, it's a little less balanced. So obviously here feels, very balanced with this flat. He can go up on the tip to gain a little height, but now you can see he's feeling a little bit wobbly, but kind of appropriate for balancing on this little tip. Here, kind of like a stalking position. But yeah, there you go. So those are our 10 renders of our dude posed. So we posed him in the living room to show him in context, posed him on his own from different points of view, high angle camera, low angle camera, and so forth, just to get the point across of here's our character. And so with all of this done, it's now at this point time to go in 2 different directions. One, to do animation tests, or to do texturing and shading. And the next thing that I chose to work on was animation. Because again, texturing and shading is something that can very easily not be done in 3D in the creature development phase. It's something that can be done with illustrations. And because as far as the role of 3D in creature development in a sort of art department pre-production pipeline, an illustration does an effective job, a 2D illustration of showing what the skin of something is supposed to be as far as texture and patterns and so forth. But the things that are very unique to 3D that an illustrator cannot do would be something like the posing that we're doing here from different camera angles, or an animation test. So trying to stick with the strength of 3D and its unique sort of value and addition to the development process. And so, yeah, but that's pretty much our posing stuff. So definitely one of the most fun parts of the process. And there you go.